George Bush Sr., who's died at the age of 94 after serving a term as President of the United States between 1989 and 1993. He's now passed away. That's breaking news if you've just joined us here on BBC World News. Seeing pictures here of George H.W. Bush, who has passed away. His wife, Barbara Bush, passed away earlier this year, I believe. He has had several bouts of illness. He was in and out of hospital at different times, and he's left quite a legacy, responsible for Gulf War I, the first Iraq War. And his family have actually released a statement. This is by his son, George W. Bush. They released a statement saying they're saddened to announce, after 94 remarkable years, our dear dad has died. And George H.W. Bush was a man of the highest character and the best dad a son or daughter could ask for. And the entire Bush family is deeply grateful for 41's life and love, for the compassion of those who have cared and prayed for Dad, and for the condolences of our friends and fellow citizens. Of course, George H.W. Bush has been unwell. He had a couple of spells in the hospital in this last year, which was widely reported. He had been moved to intensive care for a time. Last time we saw him in public was at his wife's funeral, Barbara Bush, who passed away earlier this year. You can see him here. He was with the world's leaders. Margaret Thatcher had quite a time in office. Let's get more on the legacy and the life of George H.W. Bush with Andrew Desiderio. He's a political correspondent with the Daily Beast. Andrew, thank you very much for joining us. He had been ill for some time.
That's correct. He had been in and out of the hospital for a good amount of time. Over the summer, he had to remain at his hideaway in New England, the family vacation home, as it's been known in the United States for decades, where the Bush family stayed over the summertime. Of course, Barbara Bush, the former First Lady, his wife, passed away in April of this year, and he was, of course, as any human being would, suffering from that loss as well. So I guess it's been a tough road for him these past 10 or so months.
I guess this is a question we often ask when these huge political figures pass away, but what was his legacy?
Right. Well, he was sort of the last U.S. president of the World War II era. He led us out of the Cold War. He was someone who, was so prepared for the presidency. He had served in Congress. He was the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. He served as an U.S. envoy to China. He was the chairman of the Republican National Committee, which is the most powerful spot in the U.S. Republican Party. So when it came to experience in foreign policy and domestic policy, in politics in general, he was someone who was just so prepared to be president and had a lot of experience. He was an aviator in World War II. He served during World War II, of course. So he was someone who really had a lasting legacy. Only served one term as president from 1989 to 1993. He was not reelected. He was defeated by Bill Clinton, of course. And the central pledge of no new taxes that George H.W. Bush had promised was one that was obviously broken. And that's part of what led Bill Clinton to defeat him. And over the years, he and Bill Clinton actually became very, very close friends, which was interesting for those of us who are political watchers in this era to see two former presidents who had battled against each other very strongly to come together in friendship.
Americans will be getting the news now that George Bush Sr. has passed away. What do you think the reaction is going to be? Is he still very much part of the political landscape, or is he an era that's now gone?
Well, look, he doesn't, at least in recent years, he hasn't really commented that much on modern U.S. American politics. Obviously, his son, Jeb Bush, ran for president in 2016 against Donald Trump, and he was obviously very outspoken in favor of his son. And one of his other sons, George W. Bush, obviously served as president. He was very vocal in support of his son during that time. But he is strayed away from the modern U.S. political landscape in his retirement for the most part. He is part of an era that we as Americans might not recognize right now, because right now, the way our presidency is structured, the way Congress is structured, it's very partisan, it's very bitter. Folks don't get along really well. So he is sort of part of a bygone era in American politics that a lot of us who are younger might not recognize these days.
You mentioned that George Bush Sr. reached out across the political divide. What do we know about the man himself away from politics and the presidency?
Right, so he was a family man at heart. The Bush family is one of the existing political dynasties in American history. And you think of the Clintons that way as well. You think of the Kennedys, in terms of contemporary American politics. So they really leave behind a strong legacy. And there's Jenna Bush Hager, who is a TV personality. There's George P. Bush, who serves as a politician in Texas. Jeb Bush, the former governor of Florida, and as I mentioned, ran for president in 2016 against Donald Trump and the Republican Party, is still a prominent voice in American politics. So he leaves behind a family who is really going to mourn his loss, obviously, but he's someone who was really the patriarch of what has become a political dynasty in the United States that mostly everyone respects.
I don't know if we can talk about the man without talking about some of the controversies, and there were some.
Yeah, there were. As I mentioned before, his central campaign promise when he was elected in 1988 was this idea of no new taxes. In other words, he wouldn't impose new taxes on the American people, and that was something that really hurt him in his re-election campaign. I mentioned that he had a very long legacy even before he became president. He served as the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. He was Ronald Reagan's vice president, so he served as vice president for 8 years before he stepped into the presidency. He was someone who was very well prepared for it, obviously, and he was dogged by many controversies, just as any politician was during his tenure.
You were talking a little bit earlier that he was very much the patriarch in the family. Do we know how much of an authority he was, especially as his sons made decisions to move into politics?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think his sons by themselves had been sort of groomed for success in U.S. politics. George W. Bush, before he served as president, was the governor of Texas. Jeb Bush, who I mentioned before, was the governor of Florida. These individuals were very well groomed based on the family that they had grown up in. They grew up in the White House, essentially, and that's a very unique upbringing for any type of family to have.
Andrew, we'll just keep you there for a moment. We just want to get the latest from our correspondent on the death of George Bush Sr. David Willis joins us now. David, what more do we know? How did we first find out about this?
Well, Rajat, in the last few minutes, we've had a statement released by George W. Bush, and it reads, concerning the death of his father, Jeb, Neil, Marvin, Doro and I are saddened to announce that after 94 remarkable years, our dear dad has died. George H.W. Bush was a man of the highest character and the best dad a son or daughter could ask for. The entire Bush family is deeply grateful for 41st's life and love, for the compassion of those who have cared and prayed for Dad and for the condolences of our friends and fellow citizens. George Bush Sr., as he was known, will be a man whose death will be mourned by a lot of people here in the United States. He was seen very much as a patriot. He was a naval aviator in the Second World War. He went on to become a congressman, an ambassador, envoy to China, director of the CIA, and then served as vice president before serving one term as a president of the United States, but in tumultuous circumstances, because that period from 1989 to 1993 saw, of course, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and, of course, military operations in Panama and the Persian Gulf. So it was an extremely intense period as far as foreign policy is concerned. George Bush Sr., I think, the 41st president, will be seen with a great deal of affection by a lot of people here as a patriot and as a family man.
He had been ill. We had been reporting over the year a couple of visits to hospital.
That's right, yes, and indeed this is going to come as a real shock, I think, to his family, coming so soon after the death of his wife, Barbara Bush, and their mother, of course. It's been, you know, a very difficult couple of months for the family, and I think there will be obviously a big outpouring of grief at what is bound to be a very big funeral service, memorial service, and remembrance of the life of the man who was known as George Bush Sr.
Of course, this has just happened, so presumably we'll find out some details in due course about whether there will be a state funeral and things like that. But how do you think this will be viewed by Americans?
Oh, I think there will be a lot of sympathy for the family. As I say, this was a man who was generally seen as a patriot. He was a naval aviator in World War II. He had a highly distinguished record of public service, making his way up the chain, if you like, from congressman to ambassador to envoy to director of the Central Intelligence Agency, vice president, and then the top office in the land. So this is a man who will be remembered, I think, as somebody who represented a quieter, a slightly perhaps more civilized time in American politics, when there was a less rancor, if you like, more bipartisanship, and people actually seemed to seek to get along and get things done in the halls of Congress.
I guess most recently we've become used to presidents serving a couple of terms, but he only served one term, and yet he really left his mark.
Oh, absolutely, and particularly, I think, as far as foreign policy is concerned, that will be the principal legacy. You know, as I mentioned, it was a really extraordinary time. We're talking about 1989 to 1993. There was the fall of the Soviet Union. There was all sorts of things going on there with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and all those sorts of things that were going on at that time. And he navigated a path through those, which I think basically helped a lot of people here to feel that there was somebody really sort of, you know, experienced at the helm of these things, somebody who really knew his way, not only around Washington, but around the intelligence community and so on. A safe pair of hands, if you like, if ever there was one, regardless of which side of the political divide one happened to be on.
Right. David Willis in Los Angeles giving us the details there. Breaking news this hour, George Bush Sr. has died at the age of 94, serving as President of the United States for one term between 1989 and 1993. Previously served as Vice President to Ronald Reagan and had been ill for some time this year. But let's just go back to to the political correspondent for the Daily Beast, Andrew. Andrew, I wonder, what do you think some of the details will be about any kind of funeral or ability for Americans to mourn?
Well, you recall just a couple of months ago, John McCain, the U.S. Senator, passed away. And there was sort of this outpouring of emotions, not just in the United States, but worldwide. And he was given presidential treatment in a way as someone who was widely regarded, of course, as an American hero, just as George H.W. Bush was, someone who served in our military and almost died many times doing so. So I think you're going to see at least some sort of ceremony in the Capitol Rotunda whereby the former president will lie in state, which is the highest honor that any individual could receive in American politics. And I think we're going to see, other things in his home state of Texas, in the Houston area where he lived and resided. And I think that's, at the very minimum, those are the two things we are going to see. We haven't seen the death of a U.S. president since, I believe, December of 2006 when Gerald Ford died.
He was vice president to Ronald Reagan. Did he make his mark in that role as well?
Yeah, it gave him a lot of foreign policy experience. He was groomed, as I mentioned before, he was groomed very well for the presidency. While he was president, the Berlin Wall obviously fell down, and a number of new democratic states in Eastern Europe and Central Europe sprung up as a result of that. And that was something that he helped helm as part of the Ronald Reagan foreign policy that he was able to carry through when he served as president. So that was something that really helped him in the realm of foreign policy and foreign affairs.
Can you tell us more about the era that he served in? We've talked about the Berlin Wall, the fall of communism. For people who maybe weren't around or weren't even born while he was vice president and president, what kind of impact did he have at that time?
Right, as I mentioned before, it's a bygone era of U.S. politics that we wouldn't really recognize these days under our currently structured U.S. Congress and U.S. presidency, an era in which Democrats and Republicans worked very well together. They forged compromises. They worked well together on ratifying treaties in the Senate, on other foreign policy initiatives that President George H.W. Bush helped to helm. And it's something, again, that we might not recognize these days based on the way American politics is structured right now.
I want to talk a little bit about his decision to go into Iraq, the first Gulf War.
That's right.
How popular was that decision at the time?
Well, these decisions are obviously one of the toughest decisions that any president has to make. In terms of how it affected his approval rating, anytime when you're in a national crisis like that, an example would be right after the 9/11 attacks. When Americans felt attacked, they wanted to unify. Unify themselves behind the U.S. president. That helps whoever is in office in terms of their approval rating, because there is this sense of national unity. And I think at the time it was viewed as a good decision, especially after the initial attempted bombing of the World Trade Center and things like that. So I think it was initially viewed as a smart strategic move. I'm not sure how well it might have had played for him during the 1992 presidential campaign, which was mostly focused, as I mentioned before, on domestic issues and taxes and things like that.
If you're just joining us, breaking news this hour, George Bush Sr., George H.W. Bush has died at the age of 94 after serving, he served one term of the presidency between 1989 and 1993. Andrew, he was a conservative president. I know we're talking about a current time when it's very divisive at the moment. How do you think Democrats will view him?
Well, I think George H.W. Bush and sort of the Bush family under the Trump presidency are Democrats' favorite Republicans in a way, because they see how Donald Trump has conducted himself as president and how he's governed in particular. And, they have harkened back to that era where Republicans were, I guess, more moderate, more willing to sort of strike deals with Democrats. And that's something that you've heard a lot of Democrats say in comparing Donald Trump, not just to past presidents in general, but past Republican presidents and recently past Republican presidents. Folks like George W. Bush, George H.W. Bush, even Ronald Reagan, going as far back as the 1980s. So I haven't necessarily seen any reactions as of now. It's been I think, about 40 minutes since we learned the sad news about George H.W. Bush's passing. But I imagine soon we will start seeing reactions from the Democrats with whom he served, especially those who had to work with him in Congress while he was president.
And certainly many of the world's leaders are at the G20 in Argentina at the moment. So it's
That's right.
the middle of the night perhaps for them. And then we will start seeing that, that sort of reaction. I just wonder, in terms of generally going forward, as people start to look back at his life, as they start to mourn, are there any lessons for current US politics beyond the bipartisanship?
Yeah, I think the issue that really came up for a lot of us here in the United States right after John McCain died was this issue of public service and people who had devoted their entire lives to doing this, essentially. And these were people who started out in their much younger days as members of the military. They served their country and then they went on to serve in different capacities. So these are people whose entire lives were characterized by just decades and decades and decades of public service. And that's, a lesson that any American can learn. Maybe someone who's hesitant about doing these types of things, they can learn lessons from these folks. Oftentimes, right after they die is when we start sort of diving into their legacy and their record, and that's always a good time for younger Americans to realize how great their legacies were, and to draw lessons from that themselves.
The family is quite a political family. There's a bit of a dynasty there with George W. Bush, his son, and of course Jeb Bush, you mentioned. How much was that down to him? Did he start that?
Obviously, he was the patriarch, so I would say he did start it in a way. But George W. Bush and Jeb Bush had their own political upbringings, that were sort of distinct from their fathers. Their politics were the same. Obviously, they're all Republicans, right? But they were sort of they had varying levels of conservatism in them. George W. Bush's presidency was characterized by this idea of compassionate conservatism. He spoke of immigration reform and things like that. Jeb Bush's tenure was a little different. He focused more on educational issues as governor of Florida. Didn't really delve into foreign policy as much as his father had. George W. Bush certainly had to deal with a lot of foreign policy issues, especially in the aftermath of 9/11. And I'm sure he learned a lot from his father when he had to deal with those, what were really crises here for the United States and for the entire world.
Andrew, do just stay with us. We just want to remind everyone what's been happening. The former president of the United States, George H.W. Bush, has died. He was 94 years old, and he did serve as president of the United States for one term between 1989 and 1993. He served previously as vice president to Ronald Reagan. Let's just look back at his life.
I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
That George Herbert Walker Bush should reach the highest office in the land almost seemed predestined.
So help me God.
Congratulations.
He was born into a family of wealth, privilege and politics. His father was a US Senator. George attended Yale before volunteering for the Navy in World War II. He was shot down over the Pacific. His rescue remarkably caught on film. Peacetime took him to Texas, where he made a fortune in the oil business, and then came the lure of politics. He was elected to Congress, served as an ambassador, and became head of the CIA, before pitching to become the Republican presidential candidate in 1980. He lost to Ronald Reagan, but Reagan put him on the ticket and served as vice president. In 1988, he had another crack at the presidency, this time successfully. And there was one ringing soundbite of that campaign that would come back to haunt him.
Read my lips. No new taxes.
But his presidency will be remembered more for the dizzying pace of global events. Within a year of coming to office, the Berlin Wall had come down, the Cold War was over, the Soviet Union was no more. But there were new uncertainties, notably Iraq's surprise annexation of Kuwait in 1990. Margaret Thatcher told him to stand firm, apparently saying, "This is no time to go wobbly, George." He didn't.
Iraq will not be permitted to annex Kuwait. And that's not a threat,
boast. That's just the way it's going to be.
A wide coalition was forged and Operation Desert Storm began. The ground war would last just 100 hours in a decisive victory for American military expertise and superiority.
I can report to the nation, aggression is defeated, the war is over.
The victory provided Americans with a feel-good factor, and the president's approval rating soared. Briefly. With the US in a protracted and painful recession, it wasn't long before voters were demanding answers to their domestic woes.
We are going to lift this nation out of hard times inch by inch and day by day, and those who would stop us had better step aside.
And then came the fatal policy decision. He did what he vowed he wouldn't do. He raised taxes. The 1992 election pitched the patrician Bush against the young, charismatic and hitherto little-known Democratic governor from Arkansas called Bill Clinton. His clear advocacy of a new vision for America swept him to a decisive victory.
So help me God. Congratulations.
Within a decade, there was another Bush in the White House, George W. Bush Sr. was the last of America's Cold War leaders, and the demise of communism during his period was managed deftly as former Soviet satellites embraced the values of democracy and freedom. George Herbert Walker Bush remained active into old age, even parachute jumping in his 80s.
Attaboy!
And of course, the one constant throughout all that, his wife Barbara. They were married for over 70 years.
George Bush Sr., George H.W. Bush, who has died at the age of 94. He served one term as President of the United States between 1989 and 1993, but certainly left his mark. We're joined by Andrew Desidero, who's the political correspondent for the Daily Beast. Andrew, we just heard it at the end of that piece, how active he stayed in later life. No doubt that helped him live to such a ripe old age.
That's right. His spokesman always talked about the level of exercise he maintained later in life. He was always very active, as much as he could be, because he had a form of Parkinson's disease, actually, that confined him to a wheelchair for the latter part of his life. But I actually just got in my inbox a statement from President Barack Obama and Michelle Obama. They released a lengthy statement just now on George H.W. Bush that reads in part, his life is a testament to the notion that public service is a noble, joyous calling, and he did tremendous good along the journey. Again, this is something I mentioned before, is that he was someone who really commanded a lot of respect from both Republicans and Democrats, and that's what you see in this extremely lengthy statement from the Obamas.
We know that his son, George W. Bush, maintained a relationship with the Obamas. Did George Bush Sr. do that?
Well, so it was a different case because Barack Obama took over for George W. Bush, and often the direct predecessor gives advice to the incoming president, and they consult with each other on private matters. Obviously, President Trump has not done that at all with Barack Obama. I believe they haven't even talked since the inauguration. President Obama, obviously, in the past midterm elections, campaigned vigorously against President Trump and against his party. So what we're going through right now is, again, a really rare type of relationship between a current president and his immediate predecessor. Barack Obama had a great relationship with George W. Bush, even though his entire 2008 presidential campaign was based on this idea that George W. Bush had brought America down a wrong path, especially on foreign policy matters with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So Barack Obama didn't have as close a relationship with George H.W. Bush, given that H.W. Bush was not his immediate predecessor, but I'm sure they consulted on a number of matters, and they often appeared to be friends and jovial together when they would come together for events at the White House or elsewhere for the current president and former presidents together.
Talking about different eras, is there a way to quantify or describe his governing style, the governing style of George H.W. Bush, and whether it was particularly different to other conservative presidents we've seen?
No, I'd call it really run-of-the-mill conservatism. He really did try to forge relationships with Democrats in Congress, again, and that was partly because of when he served as vice president to Ronald Reagan. Obviously, any vice president of the United States is the president of the United States Senate. So therefore, when you're trying to whip votes for certain legislation and craft deals on behalf of the president and the White House, you have to work really closely with the people of the other party, especially in the Senate, to get the votes you need to get. So he had that experience with Democrats already from when he served as vice president that he could bring with him when he served as president. And it was really, I think it was to his advantage.
We've spoken about this a little bit, but Barbara Bush, his wife for many, many years, passed away earlier this year. That must have been a really difficult moment for him. How much of a support was she to him?
She was his rock for as long as he could remember. Essentially, as you mentioned, he died, or she died in April of this year. You just remember the footage of him and the rest of the Bush family at Barbara Bush's funeral, and it was just really, really tough to watch, and you could really see how much he valued having her by his side all throughout his tenure in politics and in every position in which he served. The spouse of the politician, of the president, of the CIA director, of the UN ambassador is always someone who is usually very visible in American politics, but nobody was as supportive, I think, to a public official as Barbara Bush was to George H.W. Bush. And that was really something that we as Americans all got to see up close. And we got to see how much he appreciated that at her funeral earlier this year.
We've been talking about how his time in the presidency was defined by the dissolution of the USSR and the sort of emergence of Russia. How did he handle that? If you can give us more detail about that, because that's really kind of a legacy in terms of what we see today.
Yeah, the main way he handled it was he fostered the upbringing of newly formed democratic states in Eastern Europe, which is something that, if you look, today, what Russia and Vladimir Putin are really trying to do is to push back on that influence of NATO and of European nations. He's obviously been trying to encroach into Eastern Ukraine and other Eastern European nations. And sort of the impetus for that was during the H.W. Bush presidency in the early 90s, when you saw these newly formed democratic countries and states pop up. And, there was under George W. Bush's presidency, there was the invasion of Georgia. There were a lot of different things that happened after George H.W. Bush's tenure that were sparked by his ability to foster the formation of those new countries that came after the fall of the Soviet Union.
Andrew Desiderio there, political correspondent for the Daily Beast in New York. Thank you so much for that analysis and background. And of course, we've been speaking about George Bush Sr., George H.W. Bush, who has passed away at the age of 94 after he served a term as the US president between 89 and 93. But really left quite a huge mark on the country. Let's go back to our correspondent David Willis, who's in Los Angeles for us. David, we're getting a little bit of reaction.
Yes, we are, Regina, and we're going to get some glowing tributes to George H.W. Bush over the next few hours. This from James Baker, who served as U.S. Secretary of State and White House Chief of Staff under George H.W. Bush. He said in a statement, "The legacy of George H.W. Bush will be forever etched in the history of America and the world. It is a lifelong record of selfless patriotic service to our nation. He was the youngest Navy pilot in World War II, a Texas congressman, UN ambassador, America's first envoy to China, CIA director, vice president and president. In each and every one of these positions, he led with strength, integrity, compassion and humility." And I think those are the sort of sentiments that, as I say, we will see echoed in tributes that will be paid throughout the night and, of course, tomorrow morning in Washington, D.C. to this man who was a patriot, a family man, and, of course, a member of the institution, if you like. He was somebody who had served in so many different capacities, whether it was as an ambassador, envoy to China, director of the CIA, vice president, or indeed, as you mentioned, Rajab, as president himself for one term.
Presumably, as you say, we'll get more reaction from world leaders and from the current president, Donald Trump, as they wake up in Argentina. They're currently, many are in the G20, but what kind of funeral or memorial can we expect of someone of this stature?
Well, I think there's no question there will be a state funeral, and there will be ceremonies, of course, to mark the passing of this man who has towered over American politics, and of course fathered two men who became significant members of the political family, if you like. Jeb Bush, who ran for the presidency and lost out to Donald Trump, and of course George W. Bush, who served as president himself. But I think the main legacy, the principal legacy of this man, George H.W. Bush, will be his handling of foreign policy, and in particular the situation regarding Kuwait when it was invaded by Saddam Hussein's army. He sent troops in there, deployed about 500,000 US troops to Kuwait, very efficiently evicted the Iraqi army from Kuwait. Didn't press forward and go into Iraq, as some at the time argued that perhaps he should have done. But this was a man who was in power at a tumultuous time, as we heard in John Sopel's obituary there, a time of the fall of the Berlin Wall, collapse of the Soviet Union, and so on.
David Willis, we'll come back to you in a moment, but we just want to read a statement from the former President Barack Obama. He's just released this statement on Twitter. And it reads that America has lost a patriot and humble servant in George Herbert Walker Bush. While our hearts are heavy today, they are also filled with gratitude. Our thoughts are with the entire Bush family tonight and all who were inspired by George and Barbara's example. And there is, of course, much more there as well in that statement. But we get a sense of the sentiments coming in. David, what do you think is going to be expected from the current president, Donald Trump?
Well, I think that clearly as a Republican himself, he is going to have to come up with the right form of words, because there will be many in his party who look back with a lot of nostalgia, a lot of fondness to a time when politics was, if you like, a little more gentlemanly here in the United States. And George H.W. Bush embodied that, if you like. He was a man who could reach across the political aisle, who could court the support of leaders around the world, as indeed he did when America went in to evict Saddam Hussein's forces from Kuwait. So he's going to have to craft some sort of statement along those lines when he gets up in the morning, because this was a man whose legacy is considerable as far as American public life is concerned.
As Americans begin to wake up, David, what do you think their reaction will be? Will they have expected something like this?
Well, it's interesting, actually, because George H.W. Bush he was 94 years of age. He had been hospitalized several times recently for pneumonia, for various infections. And indeed, the statement from his son, George W. Bush, doesn't actually mention the cause of death. I'm sure we'll discover that in the hours ahead. But George H.W. Bush is known to have had a form of Parkinson's disease. Now, he had been hospitalized just a few days ago, I'm told, for low blood pressure. But as I say, no specific cause of death has been put out there at the moment. It will be interesting to see how that is dealt with in the hours ahead.
David Willis there giving us all of the latest in Los Angeles. Thank you very much for that. But I'm joined now by political scientist Professor Matthew Wilson from the Southern Methodist University. Thank you very much for your time, Professor Wilson. I wonder for you what the legacy is of George H.W. Bush.
Well, I think George H.W. Bush leaves a real legacy of civility in American politics. He was clearly a Republican. He clearly had mainstream conservative convictions, but he was someone who was respected and admired across party lines. And he forged a close post-presidency relationship with the Clinton family. He was well thought of by the Obama family. And so he really did harken back to an era where American politics was a bit more bipartisan, a bit more characterized by class and decorum. And I think it's something that people will look at with fondness and see him as a real exemplar of that tradition.
Whoever's in the US presidency often defines the mood, perhaps you'd say, internationally. When he was president, what kind of tone did he set for the rest of the world?
Well, I think he set a profoundly optimistic tone. I mean, if you think about the era in which he was president, this was the end of the Cold War. This, from the standpoint of the West, seemed like an era of endless possibility, where democracy and freedom had triumphed over authoritarianism. And Bush certainly celebrated that. He talked about a new world order that would be built on the basis of human freedom, free markets, free elections, et cetera, around the world. And he did see the vast expansion of democracy around the world under his watch. So, I mean, his era was one of, I think, profound optimism for the democratic world generally, for Western polities, and I think it'll be looked at with fondness in that sense.
We will, of course, continue to get reaction internationally as the news spreads, but you mentioned that he was at the helm as communism dissolved, as the USSR dissolved. How do you think Russia will view him?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think that, Russians will look reasonably favorable, and he was not seen as an adversary of the Soviet Union in quite the visceral sense that President Reagan was, for example. And he certainly worked with Mikhail Gorbachev and then later with Boris Yeltsin in the transition of Russia away from communism to a somewhat freer society. And so I think, that he will be remembered fondly in Russia, if perhaps not to the same degree that he is in the Western world.
Matthew, I wonder about the domestic policy. You've talked a little bit about how he's brought civility back to politics, but what about his the domestic policy that he formulated? Is any of that around today? Has it had a lasting impression on Americans?
Well, I think we would definitely say that President Bush's legacy is more in the foreign policy arena than in the domestic arena. In fact, when he was president, his approval ratings in the foreign arena were always much higher than his approval ratings in terms of domestic policy. He made a very controversial and unpopular decision to raise taxes in an effort to balance the budget. That was something that really hurt his reelection bid. So, I mean, his signature accomplishments are more clearly with regard to presiding over the end of the Cold War, winning the war in Iraq, the Gulf War, more so than, a particularly robust domestic legacy.
Matthew, I just want to read this statement from that has come through from President Donald J. Trump and the First Lady Melania Trump on the passing of George H.W. Bush. It's just a statement that's come through saying, Melania and I join with a grieving nation to mourn the loss of former President George H.W. Bush, who passed away last night Through his essential authenticity, disarming wit, and unwavering commitment to faith, family, and country, President Bush inspired generations of his fellow Americans to public service to be, in his words, 1,000 points of light, illuminating the greatness, hope, and opportunity of America to the world. There is much more of that statement, which we will bring you here on BBC News. But just very briefly, what is it about, especially young Americans? What kind of message will they take away from George H.W. Bush's life and legacy?
Well, let me first of all say I'm really glad to hear that President Trump gave that strong and effusive tribute to President Bush. I mean, despite his differences with some members of the Bush family, it's good to see him sounding that very graceful note in this moment. But in terms of young Americans and the message that they'll take away, I think some of them will start to discover aspects of President Bush's legacy for the first time now in his death, as there'll be discussion over the next several days about what he did, what he meant for American politics and America's role in the world, because many younger Americans won't remember when Bush was president. But they'll be reminded of the vital role that he played in seeing the conclusion of the Cold War. They'll be reminded of his very strong and good judgment in pursuing the Iraq War far enough to liberate Kuwait, but no further. And I think some of those things, yes.
Matthew Wilson, thank you so much for your analysis, political scientist at Southern Methodist University. Let's just look back at the life of George H.W. Bush, who's died at the age of 94. Do stay with us here on BBC World News. Much more coverage coming up. And of course, there's much more on our website as well for all of the background, bbc.com/news. Do stay with us.